Hey, how's it going guys? My name is Dom and today I'm going to be showing you how to build this Kanban board right here using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Now, if you're subscribed to this channel, you know that I like to keep things in vanilla or pure JavaScript, so this is going to be no different. This solution right here requires no external libraries or frameworks. Now, let's have a look at what it can actually do. So right here, I can add a new column, a new item, and I can say something like, hey guys, how's it going? Right? I can save it just like that. I can move this item around by dragging and dropping into different positions if I want to. That is also going to save. And I can even edit the content, for example, something like bottle, and that is going to work. Now, I can also just double click to delete that item. So that is the functionality of the Kanban board. It is very simple, and hopefully it's going to be a fun project for you guys to work on. Now also keep in mind that this here is going to require an intermediate knowledge of JavaScript. So if you are just starting out to learn JavaScript, some of the things in today's video might be a little bit confusing for you guys, and I apologize in advance. But if you've been using JavaScript for a little bit now, this hopefully should make sense. Okay, so the source code is also going to be linked down below if you run into any issues. Alright, so I do want to show you what the data looks like for the Kanban board right here, because we're going to be using local storage to persist the data in the Kanban board, but you can easily swap it out for your own API or backend if you wanted to. Okay, so speaking of, or going into the local storage part here, if I go into the application tab of the browser right here, we can see under the Kanban data key, I've got all of the content or the data for the Kanban board, which you guys just saw. So right here, this Kanban data is just a JSON array, and this array contains 3 objects, 1 for each column, not started, in progress, and completed. Okay, so expanding these columns right here, each column has its own ID, 1, 2, 3, and it's also got this items array. So inside this array, it contains every single item for that column. In this case here, the first one has the content of edit video, and the item ID is 72714. So that is the what the data looks like for the local storage, for this Kanban board. Okay, so let's just keep this in mind when we get to the point where we are coding the local storage layer. All right, so that's that one. Now going inside this tab, let's begin from scratch to create what I just showed you. All right, so going inside the text editor right here, we're starting with this index.html. Okay, so you guys should also have a similar file right here, which is going to be linked up to a CSS file here that goes to main.css and is currently empty. Okay, I've also got this JavaScript file right down here. It goes to JS, then main.js, which is also empty. It's also got a type of module. So this right here is important because we're going to be using ES6 import export syntax for this solution today. So make sure you have the CSS file and the JavaScript file linked up just like that. Okay, so as usual, I like to show you guys the HTML and the CSS first before moving on to the JavaScript. Okay, so we're going to do that right now. So dropping down inside the body, we're going to be writing out some HTML. Now just keep in mind that eventually the JavaScript is going to be generating the HTML for us, but just so we can see our progress with the CSS, we're going to be putting some HTML inside here. So let's make a new div with a class of Kanban. So this right here is going to be the main container for the Kanban board. Inside here, we can make a new div with a class of Kanban __ column. So this right here is going to represent a single column on the Kanban board. I'm also using the block element modifier CSS naming convention, but you can name these classes whatever you like. Okay, inside the column, we're going to need 3 things. The first thing is going to be the title. Then we need the list of every single item. And lastly, we need a button to add a new item. Okay, so inside the Kanban column, let's make a div called Kanban __ column dash title. We can say something like not started inside here. Okay, let's make a second div with a class of Kanban __ items. So of course inside here we're going to store every single item. We can drop down once again and make a new button right here. This button is going to have a class of Kanban __ add dash item and also a type of button. Okay, we can just say inside the button a plus, then say add. Okay, so that is the basic structure of a single column on the Kanban board. If I save this and go inside the browser, we're going to get something like this. Okay, cool. So let's add a sample item. Going back inside here, inside the items div, we can create a new div. So this div right here is going to have a class of Kanban __ item dash input. Okay, so this right here is going to be a div which the user can actually edit as if it's a text area. Okay, so we can say something like, do, or let's say wash the dishes. Okay, now to make this editable by the user, we're going to make this or give it an attribute of content editable just like that. So now basically you've got this input field, which is a div. Okay, so that's just to put it simply, right? That is our input. The next thing is going to be a new div with a class of Kanban __ drop zone. So what this drop zone is, it's basically just that that area which is going to highlight when the user drags an item over it. Okay, so going back to the example Kanban board here, the drop zone is simply just that dark gray rectangle, which is going to be above and underneath an item. Okay, so just putting a sample drop zone inside here so we can style it up. So this is the HTML we're going to need to actually now work on the CSS. So going in the browser, we get something like this. So let's go inside the CSS now to essentially make everything look nice. So the first thing here is going to be to target the Kanban class. We're going to give this a display of flex, also a padding of 30px, a width of 750px, a background of, let's just do 009578, that is the decode green color, and also a border radius here of 5 pixels. So why use display flex? We're going to be using flex here to create our 3-column layout. So I can save this, go back in the browser, and we have something like this. Okay, so not looking too bad so far. As we can see, we've also got that, that 750 pixel width on the actual Kanban board. Next up, we can just simply target every single item inside the Kanban board and give this a font family of sans serif. You can of course make this font whatever you like. Now, when it comes to the Kanban __ column class for this, I'm going to give this a flex of 1. This will ensure that every single column has an equal width. Okay. Also, for the Kanban column, we're going to say not, then say last child. So basically, every single Kanban column that is not the last one is going to have a margin right. We can say margin right of 30px, and basically that is going to give us space between every single item, as we can see in my example. Cool. So moving on to the Kanban __ title class. So when it comes to the column title, should I say, when it comes to the column title, we can just give this a margin bottom of 20 pixels, a font size here of 30 pixels, a color of white, and a user select of none. This will prevent accidental highlights when selecting the content inside your items. I can save this, go back in the browser, and we have something like this on the actual title. Moving on, we can actually begin styling up the items themselves. So when it comes to that, we can just say Kanban __ item dash input. So when it comes to the input field or the div which the user is going to be editing, we can give this some padding. We can say padding, then say 10px and then 15px. So basically we have 10 on the top and bottom and 15 for the left and right. We're going to also give this a box sizing of border box to ensure that it doesn't go over its bounds. Going to give this a background of white, a border dash radius here of 5 pixels, and a cursor of pointer. This is to suggest to the user that you can actually click and drag these items. Save this, go back in the browser, and we get something like this. Cool. So going back inside the CSS, we can begin styling up the drop zone. So we can just say Kanban __, then do drop zone. So when it comes to the drop zone itself, we're going to be giving this a height of 10 pixels. Okay. Also a transition of background at 0.15 seconds and heights at also 0.15 seconds. So the reason for this transition, we're going to find out right now. So essentially, when the user drags an item over a drop zone, we need to change the height and the background color to tell them you can actually drop here. So for that, we're going to be saying Kanban __ drop zone dash active. So we're going to be using JavaScript to add this active modifier class to the drop zone element, and the modifier is going to change the height to 20px and the background to RGBA 000 and then 0.25. This right here is going to create a 25% opaque black and cause the background to seep through. So let's demonstrate this right now. Going back in the browser, we can see we've got some space for the actual drop zone right down here between the add button and the item. So right there. Let's add the class here of dash active using the developer tools on the right side here. I can press enter and we get that class being applied. So that is what the active class is doing. So like I said earlier, we're going to be doing this using JavaScript. So going back in the CSS, let's finish this off by styling up the add item button. So for this, going underneath the drop zone, we can say Kanban __, then say add dash item. So for these ones, I'm going to say a width here of 100%. Padding of 10px top and bottom and 0 left and right, a font size of 16px, a color of also white, a background here of RGBA 000 and then 0.1 for a 10% opaque black. Let's get rid of the default border. Let's give this a border radius of 5 pixels, much like the others, and also a cursor of pointer. So saving this right here, going back in the browser, we get something like this. I'll just refresh here and we get the add button all styled up. So that is the CSS for the Kanban board. We can now work on the JavaScript. Okay, so when it comes to the JavaScript for the Kanban board, I just want to take you guys back to the local storage example from earlier. So just try and remember what this structure looks like, because we're going to be essentially coding this local storage layer right now. Okay, so going back inside the text editor, let's go inside the JS directory right here, and we're going to be creating a new folder called API. Inside this API folder or directory, let's make a new file called Kanban API.js. So inside here, it's going to contain all of the code for the local storage components. So we're going to say export default class called Kanban API. So basically this export default allows us to then import this class into the other JavaScript files. Now, this class right here is going to contain a bunch of static methods or functions to interact with the local storage. But if we drop down here, let's define some basic functions to actually interact with the local storage directly. So the first one here is going to be a function called read. So the read function is going to essentially read from local storage directly. So we can just say a new constant called JSON equal to local storage.getItem. We're going to be getting the item of Kanban-data. Okay, so that is the key right there specified. Next up, we're just going to say if there is no JSON. So basically, if this is the first time the user is using the Kanban board in their browser, we can return the default data. So the default data is going to look like this. We're going to need 3 columns. The first one is going to have an ID of 1. This is going to be the in progress column. It's also going to contain an empty items array just like that. So now we can simply copy and paste that object 2 more times, ID of 2 and then ID of 3. So this is your default data right here. And like I said, this is going to run when the user is loading up the Kanban board for the first time. Okay. We can now just simply return json.parse and just parse the JSON string. And of course, this case is when the user is returning to their session or to their Kanban board. Okay, that is the read function right there. Next up, we have the save function. So function called save. It's going to take in a new data right there. So this right here, this data is going to be essentially what this function returns. So right here, we can just say local storage.setItem at Kanban-data, then pass through json.stringify, just like that, then pass through the data. That of course is now going to save your data. So basically, all the methods we're going to be defining inside here, all of the create, read, update, delete, actions are going to make use of this read and save function from down here. Cool. So let's define our first main function for dealing with the API. That is going to be to get all of the items inside a particular column. So we can say static get items here, then pass through a column ID. So this right here is going to be very straightforward. We're going to simply get a reference to the column which the user is trying to receive. So we can say const column is equal to, we're going to read from the local storage. Then we can say dot find. So remember, the read function here is going to give you an array. So we're calling the find method on the array. We're going to grab each column and we're going to check is the column.id equal to the column ID being passed in? If so, it's going to find it and put it inside this constant. Okay? So basically, remember, this constant of column refers to one of these inside here. This object with an ID and the items array. So this whole object is this column right here. Next up, we can say if there is no column, then what are we going to do? We're going to simply return an empty array. So arguably you could throw an error here or just return out or something like that. But in this case here, I'm going to keep it simple and just return an empty array. If it's all good, we've found the column, we can say return column.items to retrieve that items array. So now if I save this, and just to test this method works, if I go inside the main.js, let's import the Kanban API class. So import Kanban API from /API, then Kanban API.js, just like that. So now let's just say console.log, and we can call Kanban API.getItems in column 1. Let's save this and go back in the browser. And then we can just simply open up the console here and we get an empty array. Now, Of course, the reason for this empty array is because we haven't got any items inside that column. But I just want to remove or want to comment out the HTML from earlier on. So let's go back in the index HTML right here and just comment out everything inside the Kanban class. Okay, so back in the browser, and we get something like this. So like I mentioned earlier, this right here is going to be empty. So inside the application tab, we do not currently have a key for the Kanban board. This right here was from earlier. I apologize. Let's delete this right here. So we are starting empty. There is no key of Kanban-data right here. So I do want to just quickly copy the data from my example and put it inside our our little dev area here. So make a new key called Kanban-data and put the sample data from earlier inside there. I can now refresh the page, and now in column 1 we get the singular item here of edit video with the ID also. So that is the first function or method here for getting an item, getting the items inside a column. Next up, we're going to need to insert a new item. So for this one, we can say static called insert item. So for here, when you're inserting an item, you need to know what the column ID is. So we can just pass through a column ID right here, as well as the content for the new item. We can then read the data. So we can say const data is equal to read from local storage. We can then find the column which the user is trying to insert into. We can simply copy the code from right up here and just change this read into the data. This right here is very important because we're going to be re-saving this data constant into the local storage. So we're just saying column is equal to data.find, get me the column with the same ID which we're passing into the method here. We can then just drop down here and we can say const item is equal to a new object. So this right here is going to be the new item to insert. We can give this an ID and we can simply generate this ID randomly. We can say math.floor, then say math.random times 1 million. Okay, so of course in a real world application, you would be generating this ID on the server side, but in this case right here, let's just do it using some client-side JavaScript. We can also set the content property here to be whatever the user passes in. So to shorthand this, we can just remove this colon, then content. It's going to do the exact same thing. Okay, cool. So now we've prepared all of the constants. We can now move on to actually inserting that item. So first off, let's check if the column exists. We're going to say if there is no column, then we can just say throw new error. We can just say column, there we go, does not exist. Something like that. Okay. If everything goes well, we can just say column.items.push, and let's add that new item to the bottom of the list. Okay. Now we can save the data back to local storage. Remember, because this column right here is a reference to an array inside this data constant right up here, when I save this, whatever we pushed to this one is going to be included inside there. Okay, cool. We can now just say return item to return the newly created item. I can save this right here, go back in the main.js, and we can simply attempt to insert a new item. So we're going to say console.log Kanban API.insert item into, let's do the second column here. And we can say something like I am new. I can save this, go back in the browser, and now we can see the insert item method return an object right here with an ID and some content. Perfect, right? Now, inside the application tab, under the Kanban data, we can see that in column number, was it 2? What column was it? column 2. In column 2, we have the newly created item right down here. No, we don't. Let's refresh, and we still do not. So actually, my mistake, guys. I apologize. It's the second column here, ID of 2. There we go. So now we can see we get the I am new content right there being inserted. That's working perfectly fine. So we can go back, and I might just remove this line just to prevent it from, inserting on each save. So we can get rid of that, go back in the API file. So now we can move on to creating the update method. So right here, we can say static update item. Now, the way it's going to work is basically we're going to be passing through an item ID. So which item are we going to be updating? A second property right here, or second parameter, should I say, is going to be called new props. So basically, this new props object is going to contain the information to update for this item. So this could include the content itself, the column, and also a new position for that particular item. Okay, so right down here, just like the insert, we're going to begin by getting a reference to the data equal to read. We can now, basically, using this item ID, we need to figure out, first off, we need to actually get a reference to the item object which we're trying to update, as well as its current column. Okay, so of course, you pass in the item ID, you don't know which column the item belongs to. So inside here, we can say const, then say item and current column inside square brackets here. So we're going to be using array destructuring to basically then run this function. So we can type out a new function inside here, inside these parentheses, and then call that function straight away. Okay, so now if we return an item or return an array from here, for example, 1 and 2, item is going to have a value of 1 and current column is going to be 2. So that is the array destructuring right there using this technique. So let's figure out the item object and the current column based on the item ID. So inside here, we can say for const column of data. So for every single column object inside the data array, remember the data array refers to this right here, an array of objects for the columns. Okay, so for each object inside here, each column, we're going to attempt to retrieve the item. So we can just say const item is equal to column.items.find. So let's attempt to find the item with the same ID as we pass in. Okay, so inside here, we can just say item, then just do item.id is equal to the item ID which we pass in. Guys, remember, this item here is different to this item here. Okay, so this is individual to this one right here. It's just a loop, and it's just checking if the item being looked at has the same ID. If it does, it's going to return it into the item constant right here. So if we find the item with the ID which we're going to be passing through, or which we pass through, we can return the array with the item and also the column which we also are looping through. So basically now, when you call the update item method, we're going to have the item object and the current column it is in. I might just pause here and console.log the item and the current column constant. Okay, so I'm going to save this, go inside the main.js and just test this method. So going back inside the local storage, let's try to update our newly created item right down here with an ID of 41676. So I'll copy this ID, go back in the main.js, then just say Kanban API.update item with the ID of that right there. If I save this and go back in the browser, we get first off the actual item object itself based on the ID, and secondly, we get the actual column object containing the ID of the column, obviously column 2, as well as the list of all of the current items inside the column, including the one we're trying to update. Okay, so that is our first step for the update item method. Next up, we need to basically just check if there is an item. So we can say if there is no item found, then we can throw a new error and just say item not found, just like this. Okay, cool. Next up, we can actually update the item content. So we can say item.content is equal to if we are providing the content property inside the new props parameter or argument, we can say is equal to undefined. So my mistake, if we don't provide some content to that property here, we can just use the current value. So we can say item.content, otherwise just say new props.content, just like that. And the most complicated part now, or the most complex part now, is going to be to update the item column and position if you decide to pass it through. So we're going to say right here, update column and position. So if you want to update, drag and drop an item, we can say if new props.columnID is not undefined, and you're also providing a position. So we can say new props.position here does not equal undefined. So of course, position just refers to the position in the column itself, so between 0 and the amount of items inside your column. If you provide a new column and position, we're going to get a reference to the column which you are trying to move the item into. So we can say const target column is equal to data.find. Then we can say column. If the column.id matches the new props.columnID, then we've got the target column. So I might just pause here once again and just console.log the target column. And now I'm going to try to move the item right here into a new column. We can say inside the new props here, we can say something like column ID. Let's move it to the column 1 in the position of 0. So the first item inside the first column is where we're going to be moving this item into. Remember, this item right now is in column 2. If I save this and go back in the browser, we can see that for the target column console log here, we are getting the first column with the ID of 1, which contains the edit video item. Of course, this one right here in the not started. Okay, so that is that console log right there. So moving on, we can actually just check if the target column exists. So we can say if there is no target column, then we can throw an error, throw new error, then just say target column not found. Very straightforward. Next up, we can simply make that move. So if you pass in, a new column ID, a new position, let's update that data. We're going to say in the current column, let's delete the item from its current column. So we can say current column dot items dot splice, then pass through here current column dot items dot index of, then pass through the item. So what's happening here, basically, we're just getting a reference, or we're finding out which index the item is currently in, passing it into the splice column, which is going to delete it because I passed through 1 right here. So basically, it's removing one item from this particular index, effectively deleting our item from its current column. We're going to do a similar thing right down below to move it to a new column. We can say move item into its new column and position. So for this, we can say target column dot items dot splice, then say new props dot position. Whatever position the user is passing in, we're going to move it there. Then we're going to say 0 for the delete count. So up here we said 1, we're going to delete an item. Down here, we're going to say don't delete anything, but instead just insert a new item. We can pass through here the item to insert into this position inside the target column array. I apologize if that right there didn't make too much sense. You can always just simply console log the progress as you move through it. So the last step for this is going to be to right below here, just simply say save and then save the updated data object to local storage. I can save this now and go back in the browser. As we can see, we actually ran this code right here. So let's check the local storage. So going inside the application tab, we can see that in the ID of 1, we have the I am new item moved up here into the position of 0. I forgot to mention that the position is going to be 0 base, which means index 0 is going to be position 0 or the first item. Now, in its original column of 1 or 2, should I say, we can see it is now gone. So the move has worked. We've updated that item. Now, I did forget to test the actual, content update. So let's keep these the same and then just say something like content, I've changed, something like that. Save this back in the browser. And now we can see we have the I've changed updated right there for the item that we passed in. So that is the update item method complete. The last one for this Kanban API is going to be to delete an item. It's going to be a lot simpler than the previous one. So so down here, we can say static delete item, pass in the item ID, and we're going to do a very similar thing where we're going to be reading the data initially. Then we can just say for const column of data. So looping through every single column here, we're going to try to find the item. So like I said, this is going to work in a very similar fashion to what we saw right up here. So I might just actually copy this code. It's the exact same. So let's just say item column, find the item by the ID, then just say if there is no item found, or I should say if the item was not found inside this column with this ID, then we can simply continue. So skip to the next column. Otherwise, we can just say column.items.splice, then just say column.items.index of, then pass through item, then say 1. Now guys, I think this right here is actually bad. My mistake. Because you do not want to skip the entire column if one of them isn't the actual, target item to delete. So we'll say right down here, essentially, if you found the item, then move this code up to delete it, just like that. My mistake, I apologize. Then next up, we can just say save, then pass through here the data itself. So I can save this, then go back in the browser and we can actually test out this delete. So let's go back in the main.js right here. We can just say Kanban API.delete item, then pass through our newly created item 41676. Save this, go back in the browser, and we can see in the first column here that item is now gone. So that is all of our basic create, read, update, delete methods defined inside the API. So next up, we can begin working on the view for the Kanban board. Okay, so when it comes to coding up the view for the Kanban board, basically the user interface, what the user interacts with, we're going to be creating a new directory inside the JavaScript directory here called view. Now inside this view, we're going to make a new file called kanban.js, my mistake. So inside this kanban.js file, it's going to be a class. So this class here is going to define the entry point for the user interface code. So inside here, we're going to say export default class called Kanban. Now, inside here, we're going to define a constructor and it's going to take through a root element. Okay, so if you're not too sure how to use JavaScript classes, I've got a whole video dedicated to that, but basically, this root here refers to this div with a class of Kanban in the HTML. So like I mentioned at the very start, all of this code here is going to be generated using JavaScript. So that is why we only pass through this root. It just means we're going to be using this div to hold all of the Kanban HTML and things like that. So we're going to pass through that root right there, and we're going to say this.root is equal to root, just to simply keep a reference to it. Now, the next step down here is going to be to define a static method called columns, and this right here is going to return an array of every single column and its name or title. We can say return, then pass through here an array of objects. We can say an ID of 1 has a title or name of not started. Okay, and do the exact same thing for the next two. All right, now obviously guys, it's probably better if you retrieve the title from your server side, but in this case here, to keep things simple, I'm simply just defining the title of each column and its corresponding ID as we stored it inside the local storage layer. ID of 3 refers to the completed title right there. So now, for every single column here, so right up here, we can say Kanban dot columns, call that static method right there, then say dot for each. So for every single column inside our list of columns, we can simply do this. So we're going to be essentially, I'll just say to do just for now, right? So we're going to come back to this, but we're going to say to do create a column class, okay, or an instance. So create an instance of column class. There we go. So we're going to come back to this right here. So what do I mean by this instance of column class? So we need to now have a new JavaScript class to essentially define the user interface for an individual column that is displayed to the user. Okay, so that is where it gets interesting. So let's stop in this file right now and create a new class inside this view and call this one column.js. So this one now is gonna be saying export default class called column. Now here, this constructor is gonna take through an ID and a name. So remember, this class represents a single column in the user interface. Got the ID and the name or the title, okay, the title of that column. So now let's define the HTML for a column. We already saw that in the HTML from the very beginning with this class right here. So now let's basically move this HTML into the JavaScript. So going down here, we'll say static create root. So inside this create root, the goal of this method is to return it's to return an HTML element as an object containing the basic structure for a particular column. So right here, we'll say const range equal to document.createRange. Now this whole range thing is purely just a technique for generating HTML using JavaScript. So if you don't understand this part, don't worry. We're just using it to, like I said, create HTML. So down here we'll say range.selectNode, then pass through document.body. This then allows us to say return range.createContextualFragment. Then, using the JavaScript template strings, the backticks near the 1 on your keyboard, we can drop down to a multi-line string. And now we can just simply define the HTML for the Kanban column. So, going back to the index.html, let's copy this particular HTML, which we wrote up earlier on. And this looks like all of this stuff right here. Copy this back inside here and paste it right there. So, we don't need everything inside the HTML here, so we can just remove here the items itself and just keep the div right there. We can remove the not started title. We're going to be adding that in dynamically. We're going to be changing the class here to for the items to be Kanban __column items. So I made a mistake there, guys. I apologize, but just make sure you rename this to be column-items instead of just items. And down below for the button, that can remain the same. So this is our HTML structure for a single item. Okay, sorry, my mistake, column. Now we can say .children here and say at index 0. So this create contextual fragment is basically, to put it in simple words, it's just a virtual DOM tree. So basically you can just say .children as you would normally to get the first one, which just simply refers to this entire div as an HTML object. So now we've got the root for a single column in HTML. So now we can say right up here, this .elements is equal to a new empty object, and basically we're going to be storing every single HTML element which we care about inside this object. We can say this.elements.root is equal to column.createRoot. So now we have the root element. We can add some more on. We can get the title, the items container, and the add item button. So we'll say this.elements.title is equal to this.elements.root. Now I might just minimize the sidebar here. .root.query selector. And we'll just say Kanban __ column dash title as the class there. I might just remove the sidebar here just to make some more space. There we go. So we're basically just calling the query selector on the root itself. So it's only for this local column, not the whole document. We've got the title. We can now do the exact same thing for the items element and make this column-items right there. And the same for the add item button and just make this Kanban __ add dash item. So we have those elements right there. So I might just stop right here and actually get something working to further demonstrate what's happening. So going back inside the Kanban.js, down in this to-do section, we are going to create a new instance of that column. So we'll say const column view is equal to a new instance of the column. This has been automatically imported right up here, but just make sure you change this to be column.js. We can pass through the column.id and column.title into that constructor. Okay. Now let's append the root element from here onto the Kanban board. We'll say this.root, referring to the main container, this one right here. This.root.append child, let's add that column view. We'll say column view.elements.root. I'll save this and go back in the browser and we get something like this. We actually get nothing. The reason being is because if I go back in the main.js, there is nothing inside here. So we're not actually calling this Kanban class. So let's do that right now. We're going to say right inside here, new Kanban, once again automatically imported. Just change this to be Kanban.js. So new Kanban, and pass in here document.query selector, then pass through here the class of Kanban, just like that. Cool. So passing in that Kanban container. If I save this, all of this code here should now be running. Go back in the browser and we get this right here. As we can see, we've got each column appended to the HTML which we created earlier, and of course our commented out code is still there. That's working fine. All of this stuff is being generated using JavaScript. So next up, let's add the title and a few more things. So going back inside the text editor, let's head into the column.js file. So for this one, we need to say this.elements.root.dataset.id is equal to ID. So this just helps us identify which column ID it is, and it's going to be useful later on when we get to dragging and dropping. But for now, let's include that right there. We're also going to say this.elements.title, so the title div, dot text content is going to be equal to the title which we pass into the constructor. That is going to display the name of course, the column. Save this back in the browser and we get this right here. The name is now displaying, and of course we get this data-id on the actual column itself. There we go. All right. Next up, if we go back inside here, we need to now display every single item that appears under the column. Okay, so for this, let's drop down here. Now I do want to just add some code in so I don't forget about it. So before we get to actually listing each item, let's just say this.elements.addItem.addEventListener. So just adding an event listener and on click to the add item button. So down here we can just say something like to do add item. So we're going to get back to this later on, like I said, but let's keep it there so I don't forget about it. Then just drop down here and actually, make every single item under the column appear. So right here, we need to call the API. We're going to say Kanban API. Once again, it's got that automatic import. Let's make this .js. So Kanban API .get item. So calling our get items method finally. Passing through here the column ID. We'll then say .for each. So for every single item being returned, we're going to grab the item data, and we'll just say for now console.log, then pass in the item. Save this back in the browser, and we get here in the console every single item that exists, in the page or on the actual Kanban board. Okay, cool. Next up, we need to, of course, display the actual item in the column itself. So we need to, once again, create a class to represent a item. But first, let's go down here and just make a new method called render item. So we're going to be passing that responsibility onto this method right here. So it's going to take in the data just like that. All right. Then we can now call, this.render item, then pass through here the item just like that. So right inside here, let's make a comment. Once again, say to do create the item instance, just like we did for the column. So let's stop right here and go inside the directory structure and make a new file called item.js to, of course, represent an item. So we're going to do a very similar thing as we did for the column. So inside here, we'll say export default class of item. So for this item class, okay, this item class, we're going to be having a constructor. The constructor is going to take through the item ID and the content for that item. Okay, now once again, let's make a static method here called createRoot. It's going to take through here nothing actually. So there we go. So we have this createRoot method. Now I might just copy and paste the code from the column, make it a bit easier for ourselves. So I'll copy this and paste it inside here and just change the HTML. So what I want to do here is I want to make a container element for each item. So let's go down here. We'll just say div with a class of Kanban __ item. So we haven't seen this class before, but basically this class is going to simply contain the content editable input. Okay, so inside here we'll say div with a class of Kanban __ item -input, then say content editable, just like we did in the HTML, and we can leave this empty. Now, you do also want to add a draggable attribute here of true on the Kanban item class. This is going to help us with the drag and drop functionality, which we're going to be getting onto later on in the video. So that is our createRoot for a particular item or an individual item. All right. So right up here, we can say this.elements is equal to a new object, just like we did for the previous example with the column. We can say this.elements.root is equal to item.createRoot, just like that. We can now say elements dot item, sorry guys, input. Okay, a lot of words here. So this dot elements dot input is going to be equal to this dot elements dot root dot query selector here, and just passing in the class of the Kanban item input to get a reference to that particular HTML element. Now, similar to the column, let's drop down here. This dot elements dot root dot data set dot ID equal to the ID being passed in. Okay, then we'll just say elements dot input dot text content is going to be equal to the content which we passed in to inject that content right there. Now, when it comes to the item itself, in order to detect changes when the user wants to update the content, we need to store a reference to the current content value. So we'll say right down here, this dot content is equal to the content being passed in. Okay, so that right there. We're going to get to this later on and what it actually does, but for now, let's keep that right there. And now we can just stop here and go back to the column.js. So when it comes to the column.js inside the render item method, we are going to be creating a new instance of that item class. So we'll say const item equal to a new instance of item passing through data.id and then data.content right there. Okay, we can then just say this.elements.items.append child. Let's add the item.elements.root to the items div. Okay, and we'll stop right there. So I can save this right here and go back in the browser, and we get something like this. As we can see, we get every single item being rendered inside the HTML. All right, so we are mostly done with the column.js. The next step is going to be to add the code in for this add item button. So when you click on the add item button, we need to, of course, add a new item. So let's comment this out or remove the code for it. And we'll say const new item is going to be equal to, once again, calling the API, we'll say Kanban API dot insert item. Okay, we're going to be inserting this item into this particular column ID, pass it in right there with the default data of an empty string. That is your starting item content, empty, right? Then we'll just say this.render item and pass through the new item. Okay, very straightforward, just like that. Save this, go back in the browser. Now if I press add, we get that new item right there. If I refresh, because we called the API, it's going to save, it's going to persist, and it's there forever. So that is the majority of the code for the column. We're going to be coming back to this later on when we get to adding in the drag and drop, but for now it is complete. We can continue on with the item class. So the item class here is going to be the main one. Okay, so let's drop down here and we're going to be, of course, continuing on with this class. So we're going to need quite a few event listeners. The first thing I want to do with the item here is give the user the ability to update the content of a single item. So let's define a new function here called onBlur. It's going to be equal to a new function, like I just said. And inside this onBlur, this is what's going to happen when the user clicks on the content to edit it and then clicks away. Okay, so when they click away, they're most likely going to be finished with editing the content. So we can say const new content is equal to this.elements.input.text content, and we'll just trim off the edges off their text which they entered. Okay, so we've got the new content. I'm going to stop here and just console.log the new content value and also log out this.content, which we defined right up here. This is the original content. Okay, then down here we can say this.elements.input.addEventListener. Okay, when the user blurs or clicks away from the input field, we can run the onBlur function. So I'm going to stop right here, save it, go back in the browser, and if I was to go inside the new item right here, and I say red, for example, and get out of it, we get this in the console. We get an empty string for the original content and red for the new content. Okay, let's try the edit video one. Let's make this edit 2 videos, for example. Get out of it, we get edit video, then edit 2 videos. So we have to check if this value changed. Okay, if it changed, we need to, of course, do something, update it, right? So we'll say if the new content is equal to the old content, then we're going to do nothing, return out straight away. Otherwise, we need to update this dot content. We'll say the new content is going to be the new content. Okay, then let's call the API. We'll say Kanban API dot update item, pass through here the item ID, which comes from the constructor right up here. Then the object, we're going to pass in the contents property and make this dot content, the new content value. Once again, just update your Kanban API import to be .js. So now if I save this right here and go back in the browser, let's make this edit 2 videos, blur out. It is now saved. If I refresh, we can see it persists and it stays there. So that is our on blur and the actual item updating complete. All right. The next step is going to be to get the deletes working when I want to delete an item. So for this, if I drop right down here under the blur, we'll say this.elements.root.addEventListener. When the user double clicks on a item, we're going to run this function. So this function here is going to first prompt the user and make sure they actually want to delete an item. So we'll say const check is equal to confirm, then say, are you sure you want to delete this item? Okay, and we'll say if the check was successful, they do want to actually delete the item there. We'll say Kanban API dot delete item, pass in the ID to delete, then drop down here and do a bit of cleaning up. So once the item gets deleted from the local storage, we need to then remove the item from the HTML. So we'll say this.elements.input.remove event listener, remove the blur event. And we can just say on blur because that is how you identify an event listener. To remove it, you just pass in the type and then the function which gets called. Of course, this matches up with the add event listener right up here, so that's going to work perfectly fine. So next step, we'll just say this.elements.root.parentElement.remove_child, then pass in this.elements.root. So basically, right here, we're going to the parent, which is going to refer to the column itself. Then we're saying, let's remove the child element of this item, effectively getting rid of it from the HTML. I'll just comment out this line here to see a comparison. So going in the browser, if I double click on the new item and press OK, it's gone from local storage, okay, but it's still right here. If I refresh, it goes away. So having this line in here to remove from the parent is gonna, of course, make it go away visually. I'll add it back, hey, okay, I'll double click, press OK, and now it's gone from the visuals as well. So that is the delete complete, and that is the code which is all done aside from the drag and drop. So that is where a lot of some new code is going to be added into. So let's get into that right now. Okay, so when it comes to getting the drag and drop working for the Kanban board, the first step is going to be to go right down here in the item class, and we're going to be adding a new event listener. So we'll just say here this.elements.root.add event listener. We're going to listen for the drag start event. So this drag start event is going to allow the actual item to be dragged by the user. So we're going to grab onto the event object right here, so this little E, and we can simply set some information on the data transfer component of the event object. So this is basically how we're able to communicate between two HTML elements as they get dragged and dropped. So just bear with me if you're not too sure how this works. If you want, I've also got a video dedicated to the drag and drop API if you want to check it out. But for now, we'll just say e.datatransfer.setData for text, okay? Then we're going to pass in here the ID. Okay, now this can probably, or this probably should be text/plain if you want to be specific. So we're setting the text to be the ID. So this refers to, of course, the item ID. All right, so we've got this drag start. I'm just going to save this right here and then go back in the browser, then attempt to drag one of these items. So I'll just grab onto the edit video here, and we can see I'm able to drag it across. So this is the first step in getting the drag and drop working, or the actual Kanban repositioning working. So if I drop on this text, this input field, or this div, we get the item right there. We get the item ID. So this is where that set data came from. So whatever we set inside here, the ID, if I make this dcode, for example, and drag and drop, okay, so whatever we set inside that particular method, that is going to be attached to that particular event, that drag and drop event, it gets attached to it. So of course, in that case right there, when I showed you this, we don't want that. We don't want this drag to do that, okay? So to prevent this from happening, sorry, I can't talk, sorry, it's been a long day. To prevent that from happening, we need to go back inside here, and we need to say this.elements.input.addEventListener, listen for the drop event. So when the input field gets dropped on, we need to basically just stop that from happening. So we'll grab the E event object and we'll say e.prevents_defaults. Okay, so this here has nothing to do with the standard Kanban drag and drop. This is just to prevent the text from appearing inside the input fields by accident. So now if I drag and drop this, it no longer works. So we're basically just preventing the default behavior of that, copy and paste, or whatever you want to call it. But it's important to know that with that demonstration, you're attaching the ID, the item ID, to that event. So now we can move on to actually getting the Kanban drop or drag and drop working. So for this, let's make a new class inside the view called dropZone.js. This dropZone class is going to represent a singular drop zone, like I showed you at the very beginning in the HTML. So this drop zone is going to contain the majority of the code for the Kanban drag and drop. So here, sorry, had a bit of a mouth sound there. So we'll say export default class drop zone. All right, so in this drop zone class, I'm going to have a single method called static creates drop zone. So this is going to, once again, just like the column and the item, it's going to create the HTML. So I'll just copy from the create root here. Okay, just like this. So const range, etc. Now here, instead of returning, we're going to say const drop zone is equal to then range.create contextual fragment. Inside here, just pass through a simple div, okay, with a class of Kanban underscore underscore drop zone. Okay, then at the very end, we're going to return the drop zone. So just like the other one, but of course this time we're going to do things inside here before we return it. So this is where the magic happens with the drag and drop. So the very first thing to do is, once we have a drop zone, okay, we need to add that CSS class of active to give the user the impression that you can actually drop here. So we're going to say drop zone.add event listener and listen for the drag over event. Okay, we're going to grab onto the event object once again and then say e.prevent default. This is important to ensure that the drag and drop actually works in different scenarios. We can then say drop zone.class list. Okay, we can say add, and we can add that Kanban underscore underscore drop zone dash dash active modifier class. So now, okay, this drop zone class has been created. We now need to add the drop zone, or add a drop zone underneath every single item. Okay, so going inside the item class, let's create a new constant in the constructor called bottom drop zone. Okay, the bottom of the item. We can say drop zone dot creates drop zone, just like this. Now, of course, this is wrong, so we have to import drop zone with a capital Z. Okay, just be careful here. It's going to come from ./dropzone.js. So now we have the bottom drop zone. Let's add the drop zone to the container for the Kanban item. Okay, so right up here in the constructor, once again, we're just going to say under this, we'll say this.elements.root, okay, .append child. Let's append that bottom drop zone. So now if I save this in the browser, we can see we have some space between each item. This is the space for the drop zone. That is literally the drop zone right there. So if I click and hold over a drop zone, it gets that active class. It doesn't go away. We need to, of course, add that in, but it is being added there. So that is our code working. Of course, if I drop, nothing happens. So we, of course, need to actually fix that. But for now, let's go back inside the code and continue on with the drop zone class. So after we've added this, event listener for the drag over, let's add the event listener for the drag leave. So we can say drop zone.add event listener when the user drag leaves. Okay, we can simply just we can remove the active class. So we'll say class list.remove this time around. Save this, go back in the browser. We can drag over, go away, and it goes away right there. So that's working perfectly fine. And we can now continue on with more code for the drop zone. So this is where the majority of the things happen. So drop zone.add event listener, and we can listen for the drop event. So when the user decides to drop onto a drop zone, we're going to grab onto the event object and we'll say, as usual, prevent default on there. We'll then also remove the drop zone active class, because that's a different way for the user to, of course, lose focus on the drop zone. So we can remove that class right there. And then we're going to define a bunch of constants. Okay, first off, we're going to find out which column is the user trying to drop onto. We'll say const column element is equal to drop zone dot closest, okay, Kanban underscore underscore column. So basically, this right here is going to give you the HTML element for the column which this drop zone is inside of. Okay, then we'll say const column ID. What is the ID of that column? We can use the number equals, we can use the number function right here, and we can say column elements dot dataset dot id. So grabbing that dataset ID, which we set in this line here in the column class, we're grabbing it from here. We have the column and the column ID. I can now just do console.log. Let's log out the column elements and the column ID just to track our progress. Save this back in the browser. Drag over a column, a drop zone. Let go. We get the Kanban column and the ID of 2 right there. So basically, we're defining these constants to eventually pass them into the API to update the item. Okay. Next up, we need to figure out, okay, you've dropped this into this column here. Now, which position are you trying to drop into? All right. So for that, I might actually go back in the column code, and we're actually going to have a drop zone inside the column. Because as you can tell, if I go back in the website or the browser, I can't drag on top of a item right there. So the first position in a column. So let's add a drop zone to the column itself at the very beginning. So going back inside here in the column, let's make a new constant called top drop zone in the column class equal to drop zone dot create drop zone right there. Then of course, going right down here, we'll say this dot elements dot items dot append child. Okay, and we're going to be appending the top drop zone. So this append child is going to happen before we render out the items, which means that the drop zone is going to appear on top. I save this, go back in the browser, and we have some space now between the title and the item. So now I can drag this above onto the drop zone right there. So let's get back to the drop zone code, and we're going to be figuring out what position did the user drop onto. Of course, in this case here, if I drop onto this middle section between planning and coding those items, this is position number 1. Remember, the position is going to be 0 based. So position 1 is going to be the second in the list, 0 is going to be the first one. So we want 1 to come out of our drop there. So back inside here, we'll say const, okay, and we'll say drop zones in column equal to array dot from, then say column elements dot query selector all, select every single Kanban drop zone. So this is halfway there to figuring out our position. I'll just console log this drop zones in column. Basically, it's going to be an array of drop zones. Save this back in the browser. I'll drag onto the middle section here, and we get 3 drop zones inside this particular column right there. So now it's going to be as easy as just figuring out, okay, which one is this, 0, 1, or 2. Back in the code, we can say const dropped index is equal to drop zones in column dot index of, then pass through the drop zones in, oops, my mistake. This needs to be the drop zone. So this drop zone is of course our main drop zone right there. So just basically find the index of our one in the list of all of them. Okay, so now the dropped index is going to be equal to, in this case here, it'll be the 1. Do it again on top, we get 0, and then of course 2 down there. If I drag and drop onto the same one, we still get 0. Bottom here, we get 1. So that is our, that constant defined. So we're almost there in terms of all of our constants. Next up, we need to deal with or figure out, things relating to the actual item. So basically, which item did we attempt to, drop or drag and drop? So for this, we can just say const item ID is equal to number, then say e.data_transfer dot get data, then text /plain. So this right here is basically getting the event where is it? On the item, this set data here for the ID is being then picked up by this code here. So basically now, if I console.log the item ID, we're going to get the ID of the item which we're dragging across. Boom, 23044. All right. So we have the item ID. Next up, we're going to get the actual item element which we are dragging and dropping. We're going to do this using the item ID. So we'll say const dropped item element is equal to document.query selector. Then we're going to pass through here, because remember we used the data set on the div right here. So this data ID. So I'm going to simply use a query selector. I'm going to be selecting the element with the attribute of data-id equal to, then inside these double quotes here, we can use the string interpolation here, I believe it's called. I got a bad memory right now, I apologize. But passing inside here this dollar signs and these curly braces, we can pass through here the item ID. So now the dropped item element is going to be equal to, of course, the one in which we're dropping, and we get that one right there. There we go. It is working fine. So now we have a lot of our constants. The very last thing to do here is going to be to figure out, okay, I've dropped on a particular, drop zone. Where do I then insert that item in the HTML? What does the user see visually straight away? So we'll say const insert after is equal to, you know what, guys? Let's just stop there for now. I want to get to that later on. I apologize. Let's just now use the API to actually drop and update some elements. All right. So we'll get back to this later on. If I go down to the console here, I'll remove this line. I'm going to call the Kanban API. So we'll say Kanban API dot update item. We're going to update the item. We're going to pass through the item ID, which we of course discovered. Also the new column ID into that new props object. Okay. Then we'll say position is equal to the dropped index. All right. So we're going to make the API call. Also remember, guys, to add that .js right up here. There we go. We're making the API call, of course, to update the item. If I save this, go back in the browser, and I drop in the middle here, that is now saved in the API or in the local storage. If I refresh, it's now appearing right there. So our save is complete, but of course we do not get that instant, drop right there. Okay. So to fix that, we go back to this insert after code. So where are you inserting? Which drop zone are you inserting after? All right. For this, we'll say drop zone dot parent elements dot class list dot contains Kanban item. So this is checking if your drop zone is part of a Kanban item. If it's one of those bottom ones from this item class right here. If that's the case, then you're gonna want to append to the parent element of the drop zone. All right. So we'll say drop zone dot parent elements. All right. Of course, the parent of the drop zone refers to the actual, item itself. Okay. Then we'll say colon drop zone. Otherwise, we're going to be appending after the drop zone. I may have said inserting into. That's not right. What I did mean is we're going to be inserting after the parent, which basically just means after the Kanban item itself. All right. So if I console.log the insert after right here, I save this, go back in the browser, and I drop it. Oops, I drop this. Let's drop this edit to videos into this middle one here. It's going to be inserting after that record video right there. All right. If you want to, I'll refresh. If you want to drag this record video into the in progress, we're going to be inserting after the Kanban drop zone. So Of course, that refers to the first item in that column there. So we have the insert after constant. We can now very simply go down here and we'll say insert after, then call the after method to simply insert the dropped item element into that particular section. Now, if I save this and go back in the browser, I can refresh, click or move to not started, and it drops there straight away, as well as commits it to local storage. Now, the very last thing to do here is going to be to prevent a bug. Inside here, we can say if the dropped item element dot contains the drop zone, then we need to return. So if you're trying to drag an item into its own drop zone, then we're going to do nothing. We do not want to update the API in that case, so we can just exit out right there. Save this, go back in the browser, and we are complete with the Kanban board. We can drag and drop, it's going to work there, and everything is going to work like I showed you in the demonstration. Okay, so that is all for today's video, guys. That's how to, create a Kanban board using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. My voice is really bad right now. If you guys enjoyed today's video, drop a like and subscribe. I'll really appreciate it. And that is all. So I'll see you guys in the next video.